It's very difficult to summarize what has transpired thus far this morning and yesterday evening, because in a sense it's always easier to summarize disagreement rather than agreement, but there has been by and large, I think, a good deal of agreement. We talked about science, especially physics, and its defects, its shortcomings. I think, ironically, as I look at the way the discussions have gone, I find it's a little bit ironic that a non-physicist is defending physics a bit more than are the two professional physicists here. They, I think, are the realists and calling the state of the art as they see it. Perhaps I am in the position a bit of the idealist who keeps bringing it back to the possibilities, to what physics could be if all of us were, if people approached it as Einstein and some other visionary scientists have done. We've left it as stands now as almost the handmaiden of evil and destructiveness in the modern world. Black magic, Ravi has said, and I think what he meant to bring out thereby was that surely without the moral dimension, physics is dangerous, and because it has so much power and has taught and is teaching human beings something about power over nature. And I think that is true. Nonetheless, what I would like to extract from that, the moral, if you will, is not necessarily to have that emerge from the discipline itself, or to put it differently, I think it is not entailed necessarily by physics itself, but if anything, what I extract from both Ravi and Roger's comments of this morning is the need for all of us to connect our professional lives to the ethical dimension and the sense of human responsibility and just sheer humanity. Now, I suppose that's like being for motherhood and apple pie. That isn't saying so much. So what I'd like perhaps to begin with and to sharpen the question is as follows. Is there, even among the rare philosophical minds who do look at nature in a systematic way, is there something, some direct connection between the conscious human being with self-awareness and a sense of values and the subject matter of science itself? Could there be that? And I think Roger and I talked about it a little bit at lunch. And let's begin with that. Or is that simply impossible? Do you have to be already a kind of saintly person, as Ravi was saying this morning, in order to safeguard physics or anything else from destructive outcomes? So,
well, I would like to actually make a comment about this. The remark about black magic was part of it, and also what Roger had this morning said, at least to create a little bit of controversy. There were two things he picked out. One was my remark about 100 million people die, about that I was doing a certain quantification here, and the other one that for many people, possibly what I have been saying is a freedom from fear and desire could be found in the path of science. Now, I feel that all of these things are actually related with each other, so if I may just take a minute to say something about it. Well, first of all, of course, the quantitative dimension cannot be ignored. That's really one of the things which we have to keep in mind. Partly because it is now, even if one thought it was a bad thing, it is in any case, after the fall, we are looking at the situation. We have it now. We have eaten of this tree of knowledge. So that's what we have to live with. That is if one looked at it quite negatively. I'm not sure I necessarily do entirely, because I feel that it is true that for some people, the path of science can be a spiritual path. Einstein would be a very good example of this. Because one of the things which I have been trying to say perhaps several times already, that for something to be a spiritual path or a path to wisdom, I don't think it really matters what activity one is engaged in. It really is a matter of something else, and it's a matter of attitudes. After all, we get, even if one took a perfectly destructive example of fighting with each other, there are classical examples of this where, for example, Arjuna in the battlefield in the Gita, or we speak about the Japanese samurais, or sword fighting, or varieties of other things that can be a part of a spiritual discipline. On the other hand, going and officiating at a church service or at the coronation of a king by a cardinal can be wholly an egotistic act driven by fear because the king is going to behead me if I don't do this, or something else. So I don't really want us to think for a moment that the given activity is necessarily what determines whether it is sacred or isn't sacred, or whether this is going to lead to wisdom or isn't going to lead to wisdom. Therefore, science could well be a sacred path or a spiritual path for some, and I just gave the example of Einstein again. Then the question whether it really is wholly a matter of black magic obviously is related with this, because I feel what we are actually seeing is really like the classical story of the churning of the ocean. Probably everybody here knows this. This is a very ancient myth from the Vedas and also in the Mahabharata, that as is always the case, there are continual battles going on between the good guys and the bad guys, or the devas and the asuras. And in general, the devas, partly because they are a little bit given to searching for wisdom or knowledge, therefore end up losing. Whereas the asuras have no such compunctions about it, they have power. But you see, in this then, of course, as is often the case, the devas are scared and they go to Vishnu eventually to appeal to him what is to be done, that they are going to be completely routed out of heaven. And what is advised there is, Vishnu advises them to churn the milky ocean to find the nectar of immortality. And I would like to suggest to us here that this nectar of this churning of the ocean is really what science has been doing for some time, and really in fact behind it with a wish to find a nectar of immortality. Nevertheless, the trouble is, as the mythological story says, that in this churning many things come out, including poison, the great poison that is going to drown out the whole cosmos. Ultimately, of course, Shiva, who is able to control desire, is the one who drinks this great poison. I think all these mythological stories have some relevance to our situation here, and more particularly the relevance here is that any one of us who can bring a little larger vision can rechannel the energy that comes from science, or the power that comes from science. Ideally, only if the scientists themselves have a transformation of their inner nature along with the transformation of outer nature that they keep bringing about. That's what physics seems to be about. That's the ideal thing, because I think the actual reconciliation of, speaking generally, of science and religion, etc., really has to be in a single human soul. It is not a kind of an abstract idea, science there and religion here, and then one can theoretically decide if they reconcile or they don't reconcile. Because its tendencies exist in everybody, and it's a question of reconciling them in a single whole. Now, that is ideal, but I think if in the culture, even on the large, this sort of emphasis takes place, then I think the scientists naturally will, after all, they are not freed of cultural environments. It may take a generation, 2 or 3, but we are formed by the culture. So if in the culture overall there is a cry for this sort of integration, I think that will change the scientists, which in turn will change science. I really don't believe for a moment that one can change the scientific theories, first of all. It's the people who create these theories that need to be changed.
I want to bring up two specific examples, Ravi, and be somewhat heretical in my statement. Going back to the position that Capra and others have made, that modern science has a content. It's not just a method. It is saying something about the universe, about the way things are, okay? One of those messages is that everything is interconnected. In quantum mechanics, and this is from David Bohm himself, every particle of matter contains the history of the whole universe, of every other particle of matter, and makes the atomistic view of the world, including of human beings who are made up of all this, false. Now, my heretical question is, it seems to be the case, if what you say is true about physicists themselves, that if they have not caught the implications of their own work, then they have not understood physics except as a superficial affair of equations, prediction, and control. That certainly is what Bohm would also agree with. That is the stand that at this moment I would like to pursue. So here we are with a fairly advanced discipline at our disposal that purportedly is supposed to look at nature in its broadest sense and tell us something about the content, the message embedded in that nature. One of those contents, or two of them, is everything is interconnected and interrelated, and there really are no boundaries. Space is a seamless web. That ought to have certain implications for human relations and for the path of wisdom and spirituality. If it does not do so, there are two conclusions one can draw, it seems to me. One is, it's not in there at all. Secondly, it's in there, and the people working in it haven't understood it. I like to throw that open to either of you.
Well, I'd like to react a little bit to what both of you are saying. Ravi said, and I completely agree with this, that to change science, you have to change the people who make science. To me, science is synonymous with the people who make science. I don't even consider it a separate body of anything. It's just what's in scientists' heads and other people's heads. I think that's true. And Renee is saying that there seems to be maybe a kind of a stubbornness or a blindness about scientists who are either unwilling or unable for some reason to recognize the implications of what they're doing. My brother-in-law was born in Italy and never received much of an education. He was a barber all his life and started apprenticing at the age of 9, so he never finished school. But to me, he's just one of the most intelligent and wisest people I know. And years ago, he asked me a question that I've never been able to answer, and that always just stops me dead in my tracks. And because I always talk a lot about education and the importance of education, and the hope is that with education, we can change people. And he said to me, what about Szilard and Teller? And I don't know if you remember Szilard and Teller. Teller is known as the father of the hydrogen bomb, and Leo Szilard is the physicist who prompted Einstein to write the letter to Roosevelt back in 1940, which led to the initiation of the Manhattan Project and the development of the bomb in this country. Szilard and Teller were classmates in Hungary. They went to school together, they grew up together, they were friends, they came to the United States. They were both physicists, they had the same education, they had the same cultural background. They both worked on the Manhattan Project together, developing the atom bomb. After the bomb was dropped, Teller went on to advocate the use of force and power and the development of the hydrogen bomb. Szilard became one of the great champions of the peace movement and the efforts to stop the development of atomic energy and weaponry in this country. And my brother-in-law said to me, how can you explain these two guys? Both brilliant physicists, the same education, the same upbringing, same nationality. They worked together for years, and yet they ended up taking completely diametrically opposite moral stands. As I say, I have no answer to this question, but it sure throws a monkey wrench into the works for me, because it scares me. What Avi was suggesting this morning, again, is sort of the same idea with Newton. That here was again a brilliant scientist who was thoroughly immersed in both religion and philosophy on the one hand and science on the other, and yet it didn't seem to make the slightest bit of difference. He was a louse. He was a stinker all his life. How can we hope to change scientists or people generally with education if we constantly come up against these kinds of paradoxes and inconsistencies? The other thing that comes to my mind in connection with this is the work of Thomas Kuhn, the historian of science, who has written a book that's become sort of a classic and a major theme and idea for other people. It's called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And in this book, which is now, 10 or 15 years old now, he says that scientific ideas and concepts run in styles, in fashions, so to speak, that there'll be the Newtonian era, and then along will come some upheaval, and then there'll be the Einstein era. And so that there are these changes, and people, he says, don't get changed from one paradigm, as he calls them, to another by being convinced. He said the way the change occurs is that the old guard dies out and the new generation comes in that's brought up on the new ideas. Now, if that's the case, it's sort of, I don't know what it means for education. I guess it fits in there somewhere, although it's kind of discouraging to think that despite all the education, you just have to wait another generation or two till people die out and then the new ideas are born. If that's the case, I'm not sure that, I'm not accepting that as gospel or anything. But what concerns me are the trephils, because I thought we were getting into the generation that was going to start accepting science on a holistic and spiritual basis. I thought that maybe the ice had finally broken and was beginning to loosen. But now I see a reaction already. Does that mean we're going to have to wait another 2 or 3 generations before? Meantime, we're building more bombs and polluting the environment. I don't know how much longer we can hold out. So, it's not like these are just the thoughts that have come up thinking about the questions that you're raising. But it seems to me that the issue of the morality, the ethics, is central. I mean, what difference does it make? All the education, all the philosophy, all the science, if people don't act like decent human beings. That's fundamental. If it doesn't have any effect on your life and the fruits of your labors and so on, then what difference does it make?
You have to get them young. That's one thing I think that follows from it, I would think.
You have to get them young.
Yeah.
On the other hand, from what both of you have said this morning, both a kind of cautionary note and the notion of metaphor, science is metaphor, that prompts me to ask my same question once again. Can we know nature? Are there metaphors that are truer, regardless of the consensus of the scientific community, those who die out or don't die out, according to Tom Kuhn's? Are there views that are further away from the truth, and are there views that are closer to the truth? And if so, on what basis would you say yes or no?
Well, I think so. I think after all, within science, to be sure, to be able to say that something is closer to the truth or farther from the truth is not an easy matter. I think this is first of all necessary to say, because even to determine what is close to truth or isn't, or whether some data supports theory or not, is so much a matter of what sort of theory one has and what kind of data one has, because theory and experiments are really much more intertwined with each other than one normally thinks. Ordinarily, people outside think we have a bunch of theories and data is somehow crystal clear and we can see clearly whether it proves the theory or not. Especially in physics, particularly really in this century, most of the experimental observations are of the kind that they can be interpreted only indirectly, whether a particular track or a particular little squiggle or wiggle means this or that. So much depends on the kind of theory one has even to think about this. So it's not the observation is really, to be sure, in some sciences it's not that far out kind of observation, but in physics it's particularly so, and especially in this century, that nothing is, what I'm really saying is that between a theory and the final test of it, or final record that we have of anything, countermeasures or whatever, there are lots of other steps in between. So there is not a straightforward confirmation of a theory or falsification of a theory. Nevertheless, I don't think it's totally random. After all, there are theories that do get thrown out, and when the kind of remark that you attributed to Kuhn, it is true that no scientist who has either generated that theory or who belongs to sort of a school where that theory is held is very happy to give that theory up. And the only way that's, for example, let me give you an example of this. The school in Berkeley, physics school in Berkeley, would probably never give up the idea of bootstrap theory as long as Jeffrey Chew is alive there. Mm-hmm. Just because to some extent the whole ruddy thing is so complicated, both its theory itself and its opposing theory, the quark model, you're talking about such complicated areas that no experimental observations really settles the issue. One can always find something or the other. But for some people, usually for younger people within physics, they will sooner or later begin to have a feeling that one thing is leading to more productive ideas and the other isn't. But that will not happen at Berkeley, you can be sure. As long as Jeffrey Chew is there, everybody's positions there and hiring, then firing, then research grants, everything depends on him. Therefore, at Berkeley, it will have to wait until he meets his just reward somewhere else. And then the theory may change. I'm not necessarily saying that bootstrap theory is wrong. Actually, I personally find it more appealing than the other one. But elsewhere, it might change quicker. So, no scientist is particularly anxious to have his ideas torn down, and nor is his school particularly anxious. Nevertheless, sooner or later, I think, and it's not often all that late, there is a kind of a consensus that develops. And mostly really based on some sort of data. It's not just random. Even though there are reactions. For example, relativity theory. Immediately to this, there were many reactions. Calling it Jewish, calling it fascist, calling it Marxist, you name it. Whatever people didn't like about it, they just called it whatever. Or idealistic, or some said it's too realistic, it doesn't matter what. It's just anything could be criticized. But very soon, major physicists began to see something of merit in this. So I'm not saying that it is immediately accepted. To be sure, there is much resistance to this kind of thing, but it gets accepted. But it gets accepted because either it has a consistency or generality, or it agrees with data. So these are the, if you wanted to have specific criteria, these are some of the criteria.
Right. So you're saying it's not helter-skelter. I mean, there may be subjective elements and people may produce scientific equations and theories to get grants, but the end result of the product are not necessarily subjective. There is consensus and validation and so on. Do you agree? Do you have anything else about that?
No, I don't. My problem is not that. My problem is the time scale. It's one thing to talk about the criteria for accepting scientific evidence and developing a new theory. I don't think the idea of bringing a holistic viewpoint into science would be looked upon that way. What would convince people would not be a matter of evidence and experimental data. It is more a matter of inner sensibilities, aesthetic criteria, and ethical criteria. And so that's, not that won't work, but that takes longer. It isn't just a matter of evidence. And I'm just concerned about the time scale. And then I see people like Trefel coming along, turning things back. That's what I'm concerned about. There must be a way. I don't know what it is. I think education contributes, culture contributes, and somehow or other just plain old time seems to contribute in the passing of one generation. But I'm worried about the time scale that we have.
But I think at that level, you see, you've shifted the problem a little, and I think we need to really focus on this. This whole business of, for example, interconnectedness or a holistic view, etc. Strictly speaking, this is really not science anymore. We're not talking about science here.
Why not?
Because the examples of the kind that Kuhn gave, or the one that I was, for example, referring to move from a Newtonian paradigm to an Einsteinian paradigm, without any emotional content in it, what one is actually talking about is a physical theory being replaced by another physical theory. But when one talks about a, if you like, a overall feeling about the world within which or with which one does science, there you're really not actually talking about a scientific theory, you're talking about the conditions of a scientific theory. What I'm really saying is to change from Newtonian theory of gravitation to Einsteinian theory of gravitation is itself a change of scientific theory. But then it can generate a change of worldview. Maybe even a better example, perhaps more familiar to all of us, will be a change from the earth-centered system of the solar system to a sun-centered system. Maybe this is in a way a simpler example because relativity theory gets a little too complicated. Now here, I think there are two entirely different things which took place. One is just the straightforward change within a scientific theory. Now that itself is not an easy problem. It took a long effort and not everybody accepted it. There were other kind of solutions. Many people even showed the equivalence, complete rigid mathematical equivalence of the two systems. Or then Tycho Brahe had sort of an intermediate kind of system that everything moved around, all the planets except the Earth moved around the Sun, but then everything moved around the Earth. But a lovely compromise, I must say, and it works. But you see, all that is really at the level of a change within science.
Ravi, excuse me, that is what I'm questioning. You see, I am stepping outside the framework, and luckily, for this moment, since I'm not a physicist, I'm allowed to do that. I don't have to stay in the framework.
We're also allowed to do it.
Okay, you're allowed to do it.
We're also human beings.
Okay, here is what I would say, and this is, I think, the very heart of the issue, and what the seminar is addressing. Somebody can say, yes, it's not, no, you can. Somebody can say you can never get what I want to get from this. You can never get a genuine integration, holistic world picture, the argument that we are interconnected and so on. You can never get that from science. And if I press and say, why not, given what quantum mechanics and relativity is saying, then the other person can answer in the vein that you have and say that in the case of Newtonian versus Einsteinian physics, we switched only the content, but the level of discourse is equivalent and is the same. All right, that's claim one. I am trying to push us beyond claim one into another kind of claim altogether, and I'm surely not the only one in the world doing this. David Bohm, for example, does do that, and his point is we have to go back a step and ask, what is science? Now, science means knowledge, ciencia, and I am asking, why is it the case that knowledge and knowledge about nature and where we are, all right, the cosmology, why must that by definition rule out the knowledge about the knower? Why can that connection not be made? And then you, or some representing, let's say at this moment, conventional physics says, because that's not what this discourse is about. But somebody like Bohm, for example, Cooperative, says, yes, that is what this discourse is about. That is the new science. It now says you can no longer leave the observer out of the picture. The universe is participatory. And Wheeler also says that, by the way, and he makes the claim a little bit beyond what you gave this morning. You break in and you reach in and break the glass, he says. That's John Wheeler. That's how you read the data of physics, where it used to be thought that the data is safeguard behind glass, and our role, the consciousness, is to read it. But he says that is a false model, because you don't even get the data unless you yourself in some way become part of it. Now perhaps that's too extravagant, but there are people who make that claim. Wheeler is one, Bohm is another, Copper is another. I am asking, is it correct to allow science, including physics, to rule out consciousness, or is it incorrect? That's what we're debating.
All right, let me give a more or less completely a parallel example, but because it is simpler and a little further back in history, we have in a way more data about it. When Newton wrote the Principia, and here this this really is regarded as the greatest scientific work ever written, and this is what ushered in the modern age of science and technology, everything else. And there are all kinds of accolades that he got. God said, "Let Newton be," and there was light. This is a poem of Alexander Pope. And things like that. Now, of course, the Principia has no place to the 17th century equivalent of consciousness, namely God. And I'm trying to make a complete parallel here so that we can see. And Newton, of course, is immediately asked by the contemporary divines, now what are we to do with this system? This doesn't even speak about God anywhere. It has laws of gravitation, it has all laws of motion, it has everything else, and the system is explained. So Newton, of course, says, well, of course, the very proper purpose of natural philosophy, which is physics in our modern terminology, is to ultimately, he says, my book will be successful or my system will be successful if it actually convinces the reader about the existence of a God. And because that's what the whole book is about. Now you replace Newton by Bohm temporarily and God by consciousness. And you have exactly the contemporary scene that's going on. And then, of course, the divines are very happy, just like our contemporary Inayat Khan and all of these other characters get very happy about Capra having said something, so let's, every religious types feel very happy if they have a physicist supporting them.
Sure.
Especially these days. Krishnamurti always likes David Bohm by his side for the same reasons. And the difficulty is that it really has had absolutely no actual effect on the doings of science in the immediate circles of Newton or immediately following circles of Newton. So we have something hardly 100 years later. At that time things used to take that long. These days it'll be about 10 years later. So we get now a Trefl here, then we got Laplace there. Laplace saying, he wrote this great book, Celestial Mechanics, 3 or 4 volume, and Napoleon apparently asked him, how come there is no mention of God in this? He says, well, there is no need for such a hypothesis in this system. So now you can replace Laplace by Trefl. You see, what I'm really simply trying to say is this, that we have parallels of this in history of science. It's not that for the first time the problem has arisen. Physics particularly, because of its somewhat more exact nature than other sciences, proceeds with its own procedures, methods, theories, which of course doesn't stop anybody from interpreting those in whichever way one likes. And I personally feel happier with Bohm's interpretation rather than with Trefl's, because one has a larger emotional juice flowing from this. And one feels somehow that it does connect me with something. But really, in fact, it doesn't have anything to do with physics anymore. That doesn't mean that Bohm is therefore a bad guy or Newton was a bad guy for mentioning God. Because they are also human beings. They also have need for other things. They also wish to see that their work has some meaning. And for them, it does have meaning. On the other hand, I can give you 10 propositions from Oriental metaphysics which are wholly not to be found anywhere in contemporary physics. Then what are we to do? Or similarly, other things in contemporary physics which have no analog in Oriental metaphysics. Then what are we to do? See, if we get on to this horse thinking everything we can really, now we are back to Oriental metaphysics or the ancient truths, I think we actually put ourselves just like the Christian theologians did with Newton's system. They staked Christianity on a wrong horse altogether. And I'm afraid exactly this is what is going to happen with Oriental metaphysics. We'll stake it wholly on the bootstrap theory, and will be strung up by the bootstrap theory, just like the Christian divines were strung up by the Newtonian mechanics.
Yeah, I've thought it's the Bernstein thesis, and I'd like to respond, but maybe you want to get into this.
I want to make some comments about this. If, as Laplace says, he doesn't need the hypothesis of God, and if, as Trefil could say the same thing, I don't need the hypothesis of God to work this system out, that's absolutely correct. If what you want to do is send somebody to the moon,
That's right.
or make a hydrogen bomb, or build a computer. But if you want to know why you're here, or what the world is, what the sense of it all is, then it doesn't begin to answer the question. And you stated that by saying it's not physics anymore. Right. And so the issue is, can we any longer afford to allow physics to get away with that? Can we any longer allow physics to say, we shall define the bounds of what physics is and what it isn't. And any problems that we don't like or we don't think should fit, we will exclude and we will not allow to be physics. Call it metaphysics, call it religion, call it philosophy, call it anything you like, but it ain't physics and we're not going to have anything to do with it. Can we do that anymore? It seems to me that that's the crucial thing right now, is that physics is undergoing, has to undergo a new birth, and it is balking at the idea of going through that labor and that pain. It doesn't want to do it. It wants to stay the way it was. It doesn't want to have anything to do with metaphysics or philosophy or religion. It never did, or at least it hasn't for 500 years, and it doesn't want to do it now. I think it's a combination of laziness and fear and a lot of other things. And I think that it is no longer permissible to exclude questions that are so central to human life from any area of study.
But I think one goes at it really in varieties of ways. If, in a way, why do we really need to be that stuck about the fact that we have to call it physics? After all, Theosophy, for at least 100 years, and many other people in different names and different forms, actually have been interested in larger issues than physics. It hasn't stopped anybody from doing it.
That's right.
Right? So it is because we give so much importance to physics, we want to label it physics and do it theosophy. Now, I'm not saying that there is anything wrong even with that. I think it's a good idea to shake the foundations of physics, and I even rather agree with you. I was even suggesting that if we get at the young people rather earlier, maybe the next generation or two, by the time they come to graduate schools, they would naturally think it is an intelligent thing to do, to consider larger dimensions of physics. I mean, after all, certain things just seem to us natural, and they do largely because we grow up thinking that this is natural. And this is where I also feel the very presence of other cultures or physicists from other cultures is actually going to help.
Right.
I mean, after all, with all due courtesy to Bohm, really all that he says is just watered down Vedanta. It's all pretty straightforward. Now, if he had grown up with that, he would have even less hassle with this. He would just assume this is, of course, true. I have no hassle with this. Actually, everything Bohm says seems to me to be so absolutely straightforward and plain, I don't see what the fuss is about.
That's right. That's because you're in two departments, Ravi, religion and physics.
But really the point I'm making, Roger, is that if we how do we educate the young? I don't know. Many things come in, including the fact that we are now at the moon or we are now having other cultural influences. All of those are part of the influence. Therefore, it will change. I have no doubt about this. But meanwhile, I'm not really so concerned that it has to be called physics. I mean, physics, after all, Theosophy has been quite doing a quite an honest to goodness job as far as I can see. Even within physics, there are only very few people, always, whether it was in Newton's time or in our own times, very few people who are really philosophically oriented about it in any case. So, I think we could take a many-fronted approach to this. And I don't really feel that we need to even worry about whether Trefil and others will allow us the luxury of calling it physics. Well, they can go jump in the ocean if they don't want to call it physics. We'll still get on with doing what is interesting to do.
That's good. One reason is that if physics is the discipline of investigating the laws of matter and energy, and then I think, as you said, the esoteric disciplines, Theosophy and others, have always done this. They've looked at and studied the laws of matter and energy and consciousness and the connection. They call it occultism at that time. And the only reason why, you say, why not let the physics do its thing and so on, there is some, just as you want one equation or two, if you can have it, not 100, there is something aesthetically more satisfying about having a unified approach to the occult universe, if you want to call it that. And one wants to think that there aren't 2 or 3 or 6 different fields all looking into the laws of matter and energy. One wants to think that they're going parallelly at the very least.
No, you see, now this is where I would disagree with you. I really feel that what Theosophy and other spiritually oriented disciplines are trying to do, they are not going parallel with physics. They have the capacity to include physics. And it doesn't work the other way around. Just like physics has the capacity to include chemistry. It doesn't work the other way around. Then physics and chemistry have the capacity to include geology. It doesn't work the other way around. So one of the points that really needs to be made here, that it's not any kind of a democracy about this. It is really in fact a question of seeing there are subtler levels. And anybody concerned with subtler levels by definition has at least the philosophical possibility of including grosser levels. And therefore, if one maintains a clear distinction that there are vertical levels of division of labor here, no chemists get upset about physicists or physics. We're not concerned about the fact that, look, the chemists are not doing physics. Why should they? They are doing a limited job. They can carry on doing it. If we are not hung up about the power of physics, then we can happily say, well, look, they're doing a limited job, let them do it. Go do it, boys.
But we are.
Right.
That's
We
the
are
trouble.
doing a
It's
limited
not,
job.
the analogy is exactly right, but the trouble is everybody does consider physics the be-all and the end-all.
But we don't have to. This is where we come in, Roger. I mean, we have to keep
but
telling people that it isn't the be-all and the end-all.
if a physicist gets up and says something, everybody automatically believes it. If a theologian gets up and says something, everybody says,
That's
oh,
why
that's
they invited
baloney.
us now. The Will can get up and say something. People can believe. But what we have to say is exactly this, that physics is not the be-all and the end. It has its limitations.
If physics is going to remain limited in the sense that we're talking about it, to restrict itself to a quantitative description of just the material aspects of the world, then it has to give up this. And I admit we're saying, but most people, it's sort of become a doctrine of our civilization, is that physics is the ultimate science. It is the best approach to the truth. It's the closest approach to the truth. All of these things, and that's a tremendous bias that we all carry around with us. It's almost something in our bones by now. This has been going on for hundreds of years. And so, maybe I'm impatient.
Let's say it's a bias that after this afternoon, this group will certainly never carry with it again, right? Having heard that. Well, I think I'm going to thank Dr. Ravi Ravindra and Dr. Roger Jones very heartily for coming and for giving us this seminar. And thank you for participating.
Thank you, Renee Weber.
Thank myself, can I?
Yes.